Hello, friends. It's Chapo.
At this point, amongst its learned scholarly class. So let us turn to our little rebel, Xiuquan. Now, Joseph Smith emerged in basically the same economic circumstances as Xiuquan did. But his family were, of course, yeoman smallholders who had attained land as soon as they came to America and then had been working different plots of it across New England and upstate New York. And it's in that context that Joseph Smith crafts his religious doctrine and creates a politics out of it. First, an attempt to actually take power in the United States through his run for the presidency, which was, of course, thwarted by his assassination, at which point of repression, Smith's followers, still fired with the gospel, head out on their great trek to Utah and then end up growing along with the country and eventually being assimilated into it peacefully. Here we have Xiuquan emerging as the child of agricultural workers, but instead of people who own their own land and worked it as self-exploiting owners, they were Hakka and therefore landless peasants. His family was, by the standards of the community, relatively well off. But it was still understood that the only way they were going to ever achieve generational stability would be if one of their kids made it into either the high ranks of the military or into the scholarly service. And our boy Hong is a very bright student. It emerges very quickly that he is, he has potential, and so this is where the myth of the meritocracy of the system is exposed. Because, as we said, this is theoretically open to any man in the empire, but of course, since the test is memorizing and commenting upon these Confucian texts, the more time you can spend with these texts, the better you're going to do at the test. And the young men who were able to spend the most time contemplating the text, often with the aid of tutors, were the children of the already wealthy, of the merchant classes and landlords, etc. And while by Hakka standard, Hong's family has some money, they still have to sacrifice to get him the education and tutelage sufficient to give him a chance to pass the test. So he's able to recite the 4 books and 5 classics. By the time he's 6, he finishes first in the local preliminary examination. Then eventually he has to travel to a nearby city to take the first round of imperial examinations. And of course, you have to pay your own way to go to the test. Another winnowing factor to keep the currently empowered classes in control of the mechanisms of the state. But here he fails. Xiuquan, he cannot pass the test. And he's not alone. There's a very, very small pass rate, and the pass rate shrinks as it goes on. The 4th level, I believe, has a pass rate of less than 1%. So at this point, the family's out of money. They can't keep him, they can't afford to have him off studying anymore. So he comes to his village, which is in southern China, near the Vietnam border, and becomes a local school teacher, which is, that's what you do if you fail the test, basically. And becoming a school teacher or tutor, this is sort of the marginal and low-paying work that awaits you if you make for the academic track and fail it. If any of this sounds familiar to anybody in the current situation we have in the United States. So he goes home, spends a couple years studying and teaching. So, and it's while he's waiting for his chance to take it again that he first encounters some works on Christianity by Western Protestant missionaries. Protestant missionaries had been coming into China along with opium and everything else imposed on it by the Western states, and it was making its way by this point into Chinese society. There were a number of high-profile converts who were writing their own Christian pamphlets in Chinese and having them circulated. And according to later testimony, when he sees these now, at this point, he doesn't even really pay attention to them. He's just like, oh, that's kind of interesting. But then he goes to take the test, fails it again, comes home. In 1837, he tries a third time to pass the imperial examinations. And when he fails then, he has essentially a nervous breakdown. He becomes delirious. He is in and out of consciousness for days in a delirium. His family was afraid he was going to die. And afterward, he came back to consciousness, and he claimed to have had a visitation, that he had gone to heaven and he had met God. And God told him that he, Hong, was his son, that he had an older son, that he was the younger son of his firstborn, and that he charged him with the task of stopping the people from worshiping demons and getting them to worship the one true God, his father. And while he was in his delirium, his family heard him shouting, kill the demons. He would shout it. He would shout, kill the demons. Now, after telling everyone what he had seen, he seemed to be very unburdened. Later testimony says that he seemed to have shed a lot of the anxiety and misery he'd been feeling about his inability to pass these goddamn tests. But he doesn't really make anything coherent out of them. He talks about it to friends. They're certainly interested in it, but he spends his time working as a teacher. He doesn't have much time to study, but he still clearly has eyes on making one more go of it, because in 1843 he tries for a fourth time, and this is it. 4 strikes, you're out. Now, after this, he did not have another breakdown, but he did come back home and start looking at these Christian pamphlets that he'd had and that he'd looked at before, and he started connecting them to the vision he had had. And he put together a narrative whereby the Heavenly Father was God, as the Christians understood him, who had begat Jesus, his son, and Hong Xiuquan was his younger brother, and that he was charged with stopping the people from worshiping demons, which was the Confucian court ideology that was placed on top of the folk paganism, that the fine Chinese religious traditions at the grassroots level, that this was a demonic ideology twisted to serve the ends of foreign rulers, and that there had been a real God, there had been a true godly worship in China before the coming of the emperor, and that God had been distorted and warped by the Confucian establishment, and that at this point, by the 1800s, it meant that it was in the service of domination by a foreign power, that the Han Chinese, the children of God, were being twisted into worshiping demons for the benefit of these foreign devils. And those foreign devils are the Manchu. So at this point, the Qing dynasty had ruled China since the mid-17th century. They took power from the previous Ming in the same sort of apocalyptic environmental disruption that caused the 30 Years' War and the English Civil War in Europe. More on that in a later podcast. And the Manchu were like the Qing dynasty were made up of a elite warrior group composed of the steppe nomads, the Manchu, who were part of the broader steppe nomadic cultural tradition that was most powerfully embodied by the Mongols, who had ruled China for a few centuries previously, before being overturned, as all dynasties eventually did in the empire's long history. There was this one state, and it was eternal, but the specific dynasty that dominated it would eventually, over time, decay just because of entropy within a system more than anything. A changing environment coupled with a consistent class domination is going to eventually create a feedback loop of social hostility that's going to destroy you from within, and when this happens, it is understood that the emperor has lost the mandate of heaven, which is the divine right. It's not eternally affixed to his blood the way it would be in Europe. It's affixed to his position as the one who keeps the wheels of agriculture and trade and society humming. And eventually, you have the natural entropy that enters the system and leads to corruption and indolence at the top, coupled with cycles of natural disaster that eventually make it so that the empire can no longer effectively respond to changing conditions. That's what happened in the 17th century when the Manchu, who were essentially invited into the country to help one faction in the existing civil war that was taking place to destroy the Ming, and then eventually just took over from everyone because they were the most powerful faction. They had the most internal coherence because they were emerging as a motivated force from the steppe, where instead of having armies made up of levied peasants and corrupt military bureaucrats, you have a situation where the vast majority of able young men are horse riding, are well-trained horse riding soldiers. And it's a long and bloody fight, but eventually the Qing dynasty of Manchus takes over. And so as Xiuquan is building his new theological and political perspective, he identifies first the rot at the heart of the empire, which is people suffer. The people he lived around were people who lived on a knife's edge of precarity and were cruelly exploited by tax collectors and landlords. They saw no justice in the world, and it was all understood that that was the case. And this is, of course, during a cycle of ecological catastrophe. You have a run of droughts leading to famines all through the mid-19th century, which is going to contribute to how all of this plays out. It's going to intensify every conflict, and it's going to make every conversion pitch that the Taiping rebels have that much more persuasive when people encounter it. So in a world of suffering where they're ruled over by those who claim to support all of these Confucian principles, but in practice only sow discord and violence and horror, what can be the case here? He identifies the Manchu as essentially the archons, the demiurgical archons tasked with keeping the Han people from their knowledge of God. And the demons that he spoke of killing in 37, he now understood to be the Manchu. And he understood that there was no cohabitation between Christianity as he understood it, his need to propagate it, and the maintenance of foreign Manchu Qi overruleship at the hand of Confucian mandarins. He even goes to a blacksmith with his cousin and gets two giant 3-foot-long swords with the word demon slaying sword written on them. Eventually they lose them, but it really does show their commitment to the bit there. So Hong starts proselytizing. He starts talking about all these ideas he's having. And people are very much into it because he leads with the need to create social justice. He leads with, we need to live as Christ wanted us to in harmony. And that means no more landlords. That means no more domination. It means living in common with common ownership. This is a utopian ideology that has fired religious revolts against the empire going back generations. The tradition of secret societies within the greater Chinese society, coming together around religious concepts, largely Taoist, that point to an apocalyptic overthrow of worldly evil and the creating of a equal shared Earth, which is the communist dream that has always fired the human heart when confronted with life at the end of the blade of class rule, as these people all did. So he wins over his close friends and family. They start talking to friends. They talk to friends, and soon his followers have founded something called the God Worshipper Society. And as I said, there's a lot of religious secret societies in China going back centuries, many of which end up becoming the sort of Jacobin or Freemasonic lodges that fuel rebellions against the decrepit status quo in periods of imperial decline. And in fact, in the early 1800s, a generation before this, there's something called the White Lotus Rebellion, which is a Buddhist-inspired millenniary movement seeking to bring the Buddha back to earth by overthrowing the oppressive Qing. And oppression is understood to be economic in this understanding. So Hong keeps speaking, people keep converting, they keep coming to him. He builds a whole political and theological edifice, basically on the spot, in a very Joseph Smith way, as just getting more supporters and then collaborating with them on what God wanted from them. Because just like with Joseph Smith, Hong Xiuquan emphasized that the prophetic tradition and said that prophecy was open to anyone. And so, of course, some of his earliest prominent supporters claimed at certain points that they were the incarnation or the embodiment of Christ or God, and claimed to speak with their voice. And if he liked what he heard, Hong Xiuquan would get together and declare that's actually correct. Listen to them. They are speaking with God's voice. But what's different about this is the Christian element, is the syncretic element. It is the acknowledgement of China's place in the greater world. So when capitalism really kicks into gear and European colonialism starts mapping all of the territory where there isn't sufficient advanced state authority and power to stop them, so they start flowing all over the world. And eventually they come around on the other side of the globe and find China, where instead of building a dynamic capitalist economy, they had been mired in this centuries-long decline. And as I said, it's not because of cultural reasons. It's not because of moral reasons. One's not better than others. One's not more industrious. The other one also isn't like more in tune with the harmonies of nature. It's just that in Europe, small and medium-sized states had the capacity, were able to concentrate the capital to really wring social efficiency out of technology, and were motivated to do so because of the competition they were in with each other. So that means that innovations that could be absolutely understood to be destabilizing to a social order and to the rule of a specific class were accepted, if grudgingly, on the basis that to not do so would be to be destroyed in total. That's why everybody eventually in Europe, accept the British model of political economy if they want to maintain their competitive space. In China, there is no outside pressure like that. There is no internal mechanism like that because the state has monopolized that political power. And so new inventions and innovations will be accepted to the degree that they facilitate a status quo, but will be repressed if they don't. One part of this is the Chinese refusal consciously to try to explore, colonize themselves, even though they were in the position to do that. In the 15th century, at the height of the Ming dynasty, at the height of the Ming basically pulled a James Franco and Spring Breakers and said, "Look at all my shit to the world," with something called the treasure voyages. This fleet laden with riches went all through the lands of South Asia, but instead of setting up shop and throwing the flag out, they just traded and moved on, and then eventually were shut down, brought back, and ship-based trade was repressed. The number of there was a limit on the number of masts that a ship could have to prevent Chinese ships from going too far from the mainland and establishing connections that might undermine the imperial power. But by this point, they could not ignore the outside world anymore. It was knocking on the door. The first Opium War, which happens just before this, in the 1830s, sees England basically blow open, finally, China to Western capital and Western exchange at the barrel of a gun. Not the old Silk Road, mutually beneficial, but now an imperial relationship, because they could not resist it. They were incapable militarily of resisting the British Army, which fought for the right to rebalance their trade with China by flooding it with opium grown elsewhere in the British Empire. One of the most astoundingly cynical wars ever fought, and only the British in the fucking 19th century could have got it in their head that they were serving God by fucking forcing opium at gunpoint into Chinese cities. I mean, it's beyond everything, Ed Tom. At this point, the Anglos had been driven barking mad by the beast that they'd created. So now, instead of invoking other traditions, Buddhist or Taoist or local ancestor worship or Confucianism itself that might have motivated other past religious movements, the Taiping are able to incorporate this new European doctrine that signaled to them their place in a larger world, and therefore allowed them to think politically with horizons far beyond what previous rebels were probably capable of imagining. And so, fired with this new understanding of themselves within a global struggle, Hong's recruitment only intensifies, and entire villages start to fill up with Taiping converts. It was not retail politicking. These were not people who were converted one by one by a pamphlet or a knock on the door. This was entire clans, entire villages sometimes converting en masse, because what they heard was, we can end this misery. We can make it so that the landless have land, because it spoke of overturning the landlords. It spoke of redistributing the land, living in common, living in justice, which to a largely landless, exploited rural peasantry is music to the ears. So eventually they're able to build they have supported tens of thousands, which means there's whole areas that are controlled basically by the Taiping. And eventually this gets the attention of the central government, which leads to confrontation. But the Taiping are aided by one thing: the fact that they have been able to essentially carry out executive functions at the village level means that they've built a lot of goodwill with a lot of the local population, because they're able to do things that the state can't, like stop banditry. Because as if this is the Qing dynasty in decline, imperial monies being siphoned off to private actors, nobody really operating out of any common good within the government. That means that that their military force, their police powers, become decrepit as well. The main military organ of the Chinese Empire was the Green Standard Army, and it had its basis in the Han troops who had agreed to serve the Manchu when they showed up, and united with them to overthrow the remnants of the Ming Dynasty. It was a combination of recruitment and conscription from the peasantry, and a standing professional army that was supposed to serve for life. But once the war was over and the Qing were in full control, there wasn't really anything for them to do, because, as I said, they're not fighting external wars. So the Green Standard Army settled into becoming essentially a national police force, governed by local members of the imperial bureaucracy. But they were of course, skimming off the top by this point. The wages paid to Green Standard troops had not kept up with inflation, so were no longer livable. So that led to desertions and troops trying to get employment elsewhere to supplement their income. And meanwhile, commanders would not actually replace troops who deserted or left, but claim them so that they could pocket their wages, that kind of thing. So you have two types of organized crime emerge out of that. You have in the villages and towns, you've got the gangs, triads, secret societies that do things like sell opium and control gambling. And then you have in the rural country, the banditry, people who just rob folks. And while there is a kind of complicated relationship between urban populations and organized crime, because they are part of the economic ecosystem. In the country, there's much more hostility to the bandits, who the local government can't repress. But the Taiping, because of their organization, because of their selflessness and commitment to the cause, are much more effective at protecting people from banditry. So when the government shows up with their corrupt Green Standard officials and their underpaid, undertrained, part-time troops, the local populations rally to the Taiping banner, and the initial attempt when it came in 1850 for the imperial troops to finally capture